When the lawyer said the number out loud, I thought I'd misheard him. 1,000 acres. Not a parcel. Not a ranch lot. An entire stretch of land that rolled through hills, trees, access roads, and even a developed neighborhood. It didn't feel real at first. I'd inherited it from a distant relative I barely knew, someone private, meticulous, and apparently very patient. The paperwork took months, and by the time the deed was finalized, I still hadn't fully grasped what I now owned. That changed the day I drove out to see it for myself. The entrance alone told me something was off. There was a decorative stone sign, freshly painted, with the name of an HOA subdivision carved into it. Below it, a list of rules posted neatly on a board. Speed limits, no commercial vehicles, HOA contact numbers. I slowed down, confused. According to every legal document in my possession, this road was mine. The land beneath it, the easement, the signage, everything. And yet here was a fully functioning homeowners association acting like it belonged to them. I kept driving. As the road curved inward, I saw houses. Not one or two. Dozens. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, security cameras, even a guard shack further down. It looked like a well-established community, the kind that had been there for years. Kids riding bikes. Someone walking a dog. Life. Uninterrupted. All of it sitting squarely inside the boundary lines of my inheritance. I parked near an overlook and pulled out the survey maps. The lines didn't lie. The HOA neighborhood was completely enclosed by my property. Every home, every street, every shared space. My stomach tightened, not with excitement, but with the weight of what this meant. This wasn't just land. This was a problem someone had ignored for a very long time. The first interaction came faster than I expected. A white SUV with an HOA logo rolled up behind me. Lights flashing, not police, just amber. A woman stepped out holding a clipboard like it was a badge. She asked who I was and why I was parked there. Her tone wasn't curious. It was corrective, like I'd already done something wrong. I told her I was the landowner. She laughed. Not nervously. Confidently. She said the HOA owned everything from the entrance gate to the far tree line, and that trespassing wasn't tolerated. I asked her to check her records. She said she didn't need to. She was with the board. That phrase came with a smile that assumed obedience. I didn't argue. I simply said I'd be in touch. Over the next week, I received notices. HOA notices. Fines for unapproved parking. Warnings about non-resident presence. Even a letter demanding I register as a homeowner if I intended to remain on community property. Each one was more aggressive than the last, and each one ignored the fact that they were sending demands to the person who legally owned the ground beneath their houses. What struck me wasn't just the entitlement. It was the certainty. They truly believed the land was theirs because it had always behaved that way. Someone had built first, asked questions never, and enforced rules long enough that no one remembered where the authority actually came from. I sat at my desk one evening, maps spread out, letters stacked neatly, and realized something important. This wasn't going to resolve with a polite phone call. An entire HOA had been operating under a false assumption for years, maybe decades. And now, by pure accident of inheritance, that assumption had finally met reality. They thought they were in control. They had no idea what was coming. Before I responded to a single notice, I wanted facts so solid they couldn't be argued away with confidence and tone. I hired a land use attorney, not because I planned to swing hard immediately, but because I needed to understand how something like this could even exist. His reaction when he reviewed the documents told me everything. He didn't smile. He didn't joke. He leaned back in his chair and said, "They built an entire HOA on land they don't own." That sentence reframed everything. According to the records, the original developer had purchased a neighboring parcel decades ago. Somewhere along the way, boundary lines were misread or conveniently ignored. Roads were cut. Utilities were run. Houses were built. And instead of correcting the mistake, the developer sold the homes, formed an HOA, and let time do what time does best, normalize the wrong thing until it feels permanent. The longer it went unchallenged, the more confident everyone became. The attorney explained that ownership doesn't disappear just because people are living on it. Possession can complicate things, but it doesn't erase a deed. Easements can be negotiated. Access can be formalized. But none of that had happened here. The HOA had never secured legal rights to the land beneath them. They had simply acted like they had. Armed with that clarity, I sent a single certified letter to the HOA board. It was calm, professional, and direct. I stated that I was the legal owner of the land encompassing their development, attached copies of the deed and surveys, and requested a meeting to discuss next steps. No threats. No demands. Just reality. Their response came 3 days later, and it was pure denial. They claimed the documents were incorrect, accused me of attempting a land grab, and warned me to cease harassment. They said their legal team had reviewed everything and confirmed the HOA's ownership. They didn't ask questions. They didn't request clarification. They dismissed the problem entirely, as if confidence alone could rewrite history. That's when the pressure campaign started. Security began following my vehicle whenever I entered the property. Residents were told I was a scammer trying to steal their homes. The HOA newsletter warned about outside interference. I received a cease and desist letter accusing me of intimidation. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so revealing. They weren't confused. They were scared, and fear had turned into aggression. I documented everything. Dates, names, photos, videos. Every interaction went into a file that grew thicker by the day. My attorney advised patience. Let them escalate. Let them put their assumptions in writing. People who believe they're untouchable tend to do your work for you. One afternoon, I found survey stakes pulled out along a boundary road. The next day, no trespassing signs appeared, posted by the HOA on my land. That was the moment it crossed from denial into audacity. They weren't just ignoring ownership. They were actively asserting control over it. I requested another meeting. This time, they refused outright. The board president emailed me personally, saying the HOA would defend its territory by all available means. The wording was dramatic, almost theatrical, but beneath it was a simple message. They weren't backing down. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't rushing. Time was on my side. The longer they acted without authority, the deeper they dug themselves in. Every fine issued, every threat sent, every sign posted without permission strengthened the case against them. They thought this was a bluff they could call. From my side of the table, it didn't feel like a fight at all. It felt like watching a structure built on sand refuse to acknowledge the tide. And I knew that when the first real wave hit, it wouldn't be gentle. The wave came sooner than they expected, and it didn't arrive with noise or threats. It arrived quietly, on letterhead. My attorney filed a formal notice asserting ownership and demanding an immediate halt to all HOA enforcement actions occurring on my land. Copies went to the county, the utility providers, and the original developer's dissolved corporate entity. For the first time, the HOA wasn't just dealing with me. They were dealing with a paper trail that reached far beyond their boardroom. Their response was panic disguised as confidence. The HOA scheduled an emergency community meeting and sent out emails assuring residents that everything was under control. I attended, sitting quietly in the back while board members spoke in rehearsed phrases about legal misunderstandings and outside threats. When questions came from homeowners, the answers were vague. No one mentioned deeds. No one mentioned surveys. They talked about ongoing discussions and long-standing rights. Time, they hoped, would keep doing its work. Then I stood up. I introduced myself by name and stated, calmly, that I was the legal owner of the land the community sat on. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply offered copies of the surveys and the recorded deed to anyone who wanted them. The room went still. You could feel the shift, that moment when certainty cracks and people start doing mental math. The board president tried to interrupt, calling the meeting out of order. I ignored him. I explained that I wasn't there to evict anyone or shut down the neighborhood. I was there because the HOA had been operating without legal authority over the land itself, and that fact mattered. A lot. Murmurs spread. Some residents looked confused. Others looked angry, not at me, but at the board. That night, the HOA's lawyer contacted mine. The tone was different. Less dismissal. More questions. They asked about timelines, about intent, about possible resolutions. They wanted to negotiate access agreements, easements, retroactive permissions. Things they should have addressed decades ago. My attorney listened and took notes. No commitments were made. Meanwhile, the county paused all HOA-issued fines and enforcement actions pending review. Utility companies requested clarification on right-of-way access. Suddenly, the HOA's authority wasn't just questioned, it was suspended. The systems that relied on assumed ownership started to stall. Residents began reaching out to me directly. Some were polite.
Some were panicked.
They wanted reassurance that their homes were safe. I told them the truth. No one was being thrown out, but the HOA had a lot to answer for. Ownership of a house doesn't automatically include the land beneath it when paperwork is wrong. That realization hit people hard. The board issued another statement, this one defensive, accusing me of creating chaos. But the chaos wasn't new. It had just become visible. You could see it in the way meetings turned tense, in how residents demanded transparency, in how the board avoided specifics. What struck me most was how quickly authority eroded once it was challenged. For years, the HOA had operated on assumption and intimidation. The moment those assumptions met documented reality, everything slowed. Their emails softened. Their rules went quiet. Their threats disappeared. I didn't need to push. Gravity was doing the work. By the end of the week, multiple homeowners had retained independent counsel. The developer's name resurfaced in old filings. Questions became demands. And the board that once acted untouchable was now scrambling to justify decisions they'd never expected to defend. They had built their power on land they didn't own. And now everyone knew it. Once the illusion broke, it didn't shatter all at once. It fractured. Small cracks appeared everywhere, and each one exposed something the HOA had worked hard to keep buried. Homeowners started requesting records the board had never expected anyone to question.
Deeds.
Easement agreements. Original development approvals. Documents that should have been easy to produce if everything was legitimate. Instead, responses were delayed, incomplete, or quietly ignored. The board called another meeting, this one closed to non-residents. That alone told people more than any statement could. Transparency disappears fastest when control is slipping. Rumors filled the gap. Some said the HOA had known for years and hoped no one would ever find out. Others believed the board had inherited the problem and chose denial over disclosure. The truth, I suspected, was less dramatic and more damning. No one wanted to be the person who admitted the foundation was wrong. County officials completed their preliminary review and confirmed what my documents already showed. The subdivision had been approved without resolving underlying land ownership. Permits had been issued based on developer representations that were never independently verified. It wasn't just an HOA problem anymore. It was a systemic failure that had been quietly rolled forward because undoing it would have been inconvenient. That confirmation changed the tone overnight. The HOA's legal counsel advised the board to stop all enforcement immediately. No more fines. No more patrols. No more letters. The same board members who once threatened me with legal action were now instructing residents to remain calm and avoid unnecessary confrontation. Power had reversed direction, and they felt it. Homeowners demanded answers. Why had they been fined for years? Why had threats been made in the HOA's name? Why was the land never properly secured? The board tried to contain the fallout, but accountability doesn't stay contained once it's invited in. Resignations followed. First one board member, then another. Each departure came with carefully worded explanations that explained nothing. Behind the scenes, negotiations finally became real. My attorney received formal proposals outlining easements, access agreements, and compensation. They wanted permanence. They wanted certainty. What they didn't want was to admit publicly that the HOA had no legal standing on the land at all. That was the line they kept trying to avoid crossing. I didn't rush my response. I made it clear that any agreement would require full disclosure to homeowners and acknowledgement of the HOA's lack of authority over the land itself. That condition changed everything. Silence followed. Days passed. Then weeks. Because once the truth is acknowledged, it can't be unacknowledged. Residents began organizing independently. Town halls replaced HOA meetings. Information was shared openly. People compared notes and realized how often rules had been enforced without any legal backing. What had once felt like isolated frustrations suddenly formed a pattern. And patterns are hard to ignore. The board president sent one final email before stepping down. It spoke of unexpected circumstances and unforeseen challenges. It never mentioned land ownership. It never mentioned me. But the absence said enough. Leadership without legitimacy doesn't survive scrutiny. Standing on the overlook again, watching the neighborhood below, I felt the weight of what was unfolding. This wasn't about punishment or victory. It was about correction. An entire system had been allowed to grow on a mistake, and now that mistake was finally being addressed. They thought the hardest part would be dealing with me. They were wrong. The hardest part was facing the truth they'd avoided for years, and explaining it to everyone who had trusted them. By the time everything settled, the HOA barely resembled the entity it once was. What remained was quieter, cautious, and stripped of the confidence that had carried it for years. Formal agreements were finally signed, easements that should have existed from the beginning, access rights clearly defined, compensation negotiated where appropriate. The land stayed mine.
The home stayed theirs.
Order was restored, but this time, it rested on truth instead of assumption. Homeowners were formally notified of what had happened. Not the softened version. Not the half explanations. The actual facts. For many, it was a shock. Some were angry.
Some relieved.
Some simply embarrassed that they'd paid fines and followed rules that were never enforceable. But almost all shared the same reaction. They wanted transparency going forward, not authority disguised as certainty. The HOA board was restructured under strict oversight. New bylaws were drafted, limited to what the HOA actually had the right to govern. No more invented power. No more pretending ownership could be implied through time and repetition. The culture shifted from enforcement to administration, and that alone changed the entire tone of the community. For me, the land became what it should have been all along: quiet, respected, and undisturbed. I didn't gate roads or restrict access out of spite. I didn't use ownership as leverage to intimidate. Boundaries were honored because they were finally understood. That mattered more than any dramatic gesture ever could. People still ask what I planned to do when I first realized the HOA was built on my land. They expect some grand reveal, some calculated revenge. The truth is less exciting and more effective. I plan to let reality do its work. When you introduce facts into a system built on assumption, collapse is inevitable. The neighborhood still exists.
Kids still ride bikes. Dogs still get walked.
The difference is that now, everyone knows where authority actually comes from and where it doesn't. That awareness is permanent. The inheritance itself feels different now, too. Not heavier, but clearer. It wasn't just land passed down through paperwork. It was responsibility. To correct a long-standing error without becoming the villain in someone else's story. To prove that power doesn't have to be loud to be decisive. They had spent years acting like ownership was a feeling reinforced by rules and fines. All it took to unravel that belief was a single truth, backed by documentation and patience. When I look out over the acreage now, I don't see conflict. I see resolution. A system that finally aligns with reality. And a reminder that entitlement only survives as long as no one questions it. They never saw it coming. But once it arrived, there was no stopping it.